What's up, everybody? Welcome back to part 2 of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. I'm Ryan Thomas, your host. I'm very excited to get off to a start here with part 2. I got my card, my dream UFC card, not even written down. I already know what I want for this UFC card. I've waited for this card for quite some time. And I went into a little bit of detail in part 1 of today's show, talking about what brought the UFC to the city of Buffalo. How did we go from UFC 7 to UFC 210? Listen to that. Take that in. Really understand how amazing this moment is. This is a moment that is massive for the city of Buffalo. This event is going to do so well. It's going to sell out. It's going to be perfect. No matter what fights are on it, I'm going to be there, and I'm very excited to be a part of it. Really, be a part of it as a fan and cover it and talk about it. And it's really a blessing. I have never been this excited for a sporting event in my entire life. I'd be more than willing to say that. But that begs the question: what is my dream UFC card? Who would I love to see on this UFC card? I've waited so long for it. What fights do I think would be great fights on this card? First off, I want to talk about the possibility of the main event. What are the possible matchups that I could see being made for this main event? I'll start off by saying UFC 206. The main event was Daniel Cormier versus Anthony Rumble Johnson 2. And it was a rematch of their fight in years past, where the belt was held by Jon Jones for quite some time. He messed up outside the cage, well, to say the least, and they put the belt up for grabs. They vacated the title. They stripped him of the UFC light heavyweight belt, and they forced Daniel Cormier to step in for Jon Jones and fight Anthony Johnson. Daniel Cormier won the belt that was vacated by beating Anthony Johnson, by submitting Anthony Johnson, and he's defended the belt a couple times since. His most recent fight was a scheduled rematch with Jon Jones at UFC 200. Jon Jones messed up outside the cage again, putting Daniel Cormier on a 24-hour notice fight with Anderson Silva, one of the best fighters in mixed martial arts history. But obviously, being that Anderson Silva was on 24 hours notice, he didn't put out his best performance, and DC won the fight, 3-round fight, UFC 200. It was kind of a dud. So then UFC 206 was the scheduled main event for that night, and DC got hurt. Anthony Rumble Johnson did not want to take another fight and lose the chance at losing that number one contender's tag, which I don't blame him business-wise either. And Max Holloway and Anthony Pettis were made the interim featherweight title fight, and that was the main event that night. So being that was supposed to be the main event for a card in December, I think that the main event possibility, the highest chance for the best main event for a title, this is a pay-per-view, this is UFC 210, this is a pay-per-view, this is not a fight night card, so the UFC is going to stack this card like they would normally for a pay-per-view. They're going to want someone to go out and buy it, and they obviously want to sell it out, being that it's their debut in Buffalo under the Zuffa era for the first time in over 22 years. So I think Daniel Cormier and Anthony Johnson will get on this card. They will be the main event. For the co-main event, I've heard rumblings of Chris Weidman taking on Gegard Mousasi. That was a fight that was offered to Mousasi. He accepted. Chris Weidman did not, due to the injury that he suffered in his fight with Yoel Romero. He's on a medical suspension for a little while, but he'll be ready to start training soon. And I expect that the UFC wants to put Chris Weidman back in there with a top-level fighter like Gegard Mousasi. We're talking about two guys that are two former champions. Chris Weidman, the former champion of the UFC middleweight division, and Gegard Mousasi, the former middleweight champion of Strikeforce. Actually, I believe he was the light heavyweight champion at Strikeforce, if I'm not mistaken. Both former champions in the sport of mixed martial arts. And it's a really important fight for the middleweight division. And I foresee that being the case and them making this fight. Chris Weidman wants to get back in the win column. He's lost against Yoel Romero and Luke Rockhold, losing his title in the Rockhold fight. Gegard Mousasi has had some slip-ups. The fight with Uriah Hall, he ended up avenging that loss, performing on the biggest stage at UFC 200 very well, trying to get that fight that would put him in the upper echelon of the division. He's been begging for it. He fought Vitor Belfort. That didn't really do a lot to really add hype to his resume, being that Vitor has one foot out the door. He's towards the end of his prime, and my grandma even knows that Vitor Belfort took steroids throughout the majority of his career, so he's basically a shot fighter. So this is the win for Gegard Mousasi. This is the fight for Gegard Mousasi that would put him in the upper echelon of the UFC middleweight division. Quite possibly could cinch him a title shot versus the winner of Yoel Romero and Michael Bisping. I think that's the next fight for Bisping. The third fight on the card, and I'm only going to go through the main card. I'm not going to do the full card, but I think a return for Frankie Edgar is likely for this event. Frankie Edgar has stated that he wants to fight in New York once again, like he did at MSG in a decision victory over Jeremy Stevens, where we saw Frankie Edgar get tagged up a little bit. We saw him take punishment. We saw him get kicked in the head one too many times. And it begs the question, maybe he should drop down another weight class. Maybe he's too small for 145, just like we thought he was too small for 155. And I think that was the case even when he was at 155. You could say that maybe he should have dropped down to 135 even back then. But he didn't want to jump down 2 weight classes. He only wanted to jump down 1. Now that he's a little bit older, I don't know if he can cut the weight. I'd imagine that he could, just based on the fact that he's Frankie Edgar, and he says that he really doesn't cut that much weight to go from to go down to 145. So there would be some wiggle room there for him to make the UFC bantamweight limit, and I foresee a fight for Frankie Edgar versus Brian Caraway. Caraway is a former Ultimate Fighter alum, a guy that is well known in UFC circles by being the trainer and boyfriend of Miesha Tate, and Frankie Edgar just had surgery on his groin. It's not expected to be a major recovery. It was just a slip up in training. He was pissed that he was not placed on the UFC in Brooklyn card at the Barclays Center. And from what I've heard and from a video I saw on his Twitter account, he mentioned the UFC coming to Buffalo. And he mentioned that he would like to be on that card. So anytime a fighter says he would like to be on the card, I'm going to take word for it that Dana might put him on that card, especially if there's an opening and an empty spot or an empty slot, I should say, on that card. So I think Frankie Edgar versus Brian Caraway. Caraway himself is coming off an injury as well, but I think that would bode well for both of them. Caraway, much like Gegard Mousasi, is looking to make a name for himself inside the upper echelon of that bantamweight division. And obviously, Frankie Edgar, the former UFC lightweight champion, the former featherweight contender, and now at that point would be a new fighter to the bantamweight division, he'd be looking to make a statement, building off his success in the featherweight division. Minus his fights with Jose Aldo, Frankie Edgar was virtually unstoppable. So I think that Aldo being up in the upper echelon of that division, Frankie Edgar might have to hit the reset button once again on his career. There's really nobody in the featherweight division for Frankie Edgar to fight that would allow him to build off his legacy. He's already beaten the majority of the guys in that division and in the UFC lightweight division. He's not going to cinch himself a shot at Conor McGregor, and he's not going to cinch himself a fight again with Aldo, being that he's lost to him twice. Another fight that is really growing on me, the more that I think about it, the more that I have heard about it. And it's a fight that literally it just popped into my mind today, and then I started seeing stuff about it on the MMA pages and Instagram a little bit. There was a little bit of back and forth action between the two guys. Cub Swanson taking on Yair Rodriguez. What a fight that would be. Yair Rodriguez just beat BJ Penn. He came out of that fight virtually unscathed. And Cub Swanson just had a Fight of the Year candidate versus Doo-Hoo Choi, and he did come out, not completely broken, but he did come out, it was a fight of the night, it was a little bit of a war, but that's enough time from December to April for him to come back and put himself in decent position to take a fight. I think that's a realistic possibility. April 8th, December-ish, January-ish. So I'm very excited to see if that fight materializes. I would love for that fight to be on the UFC in Buffalo card. I want the UFC Buffalo card to be a card that actually matters for the future of the sport, for the future of the calendar year for MMA, where the fights are meaningful. Trust me when I tell you, I would love it if somehow GSP came back and they put him up against Nick Diaz again or somebody like that. I would love to see Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz 3 at this event, obviously, but that's not going to happen. You have to be realistic. I know the terms of what fights make sense for those particular events, and obviously Conor versus Nate 3, if it were to ever happen, which I don't think it will, sadly, that would be in Las Vegas. Obviously, when Conor's fighting, it's going to be in Las Vegas, or maybe down the road in Ireland. So people that are saying Conor McGregor might be fighting in Buffalo, no, he's not. That's not going to happen. So there you have it, guys. That is my UFC main card prediction. Those are the fights that I would like to see. I'd love to see Daniel Cormier versus Rumble 2 in the main event. Co-main event, a meaningful UFC middleweight title fight between Chris Weidman and Gegard Mousasi. The third fight would be Frankie Edgar's bantamweight debut versus Brian Caraway. And last but not least, the fourth fight would be Cub Swanson versus Yair Rodriguez. All four of those fights would be epic fights. They would be meaningful fights, and they would really help the UFC, really show the evolution of the sport. And I think that will be something to behold, especially being that the last UFC event in Buffalo was UFC 7. So it'll be very interesting. And if I were to do a prediction on those fights, I would say DC, Gegard Mousasi, Frankie Edgar, and Yair Rodriguez. I'm Ryan Thomas. That was the Thomas Take. 22 years in the making. The UFC returns to Buffalo at the KeyBank Center, April 8th. I can't wait. Take care, guys. Thanks for tuning in.